Okay, the name of the Parsha is Shoftim, which means judges, and is found in Deuteronomy 16:18. Okay. Moses instructs the people of Israel to appoint judges and law enforcement officers in every city. Justice, justice shall you pursue. He commands them, and you must administer it without corruption or favoritism. Crimes must be meticulously investigated and evidence thoroughly examined. A minimum of 2 credible witnesses is required for conviction and punishment. So it's one short paragraph, but tremendous amount of law here. The Talmud has a full tractate, Sanhedrin, about the court system, and a lot of it comes from these few verses. Okay, in every generation, says Moses, there will be those entrusted with the task of interpreting and applying the laws of the Torah. Who's he referring to? Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel, which is the sort of the ultimate body in deciphering the Torah's law, because Torah is a partnership between the written Torah and the oral Torah. So you have to have the court that has the final say on the law. And that's the Supreme Court. According to the law that they will teach you and the judgment they will instruct you, you shall do. You shall not turn away from the thing that they say to you, to the right nor to the left. So what does that mean? Okay, we'll get to that later. Shoftim also includes the prohibition against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointments and behaviors of a king, and guidelines for the creation of cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer. Also set forth are many of the rules of war, the exemption from battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or is afraid and soft-hearted, the requirement to offer terms of peace before attacking a city, and the prohibition against wanton destruction of something of value, exemplified by the law that forbids to cut down a fruit tree. When laying siege in the context of the Torah, in this context, the Torah makes this famous statement, for man is a tree of the field. I'm reading the nutshell. I'm reading the short version. I'm not in there. Yeah. So you're not allowed to cut down a fruit tree. It's a very interesting prohibition in war, but it also applies outside of war. And therefore, other trees you're not allowed to waste. But if there's a purpose to cut down, you're allowed to cut down. You have to build a home, you can cut down a tree. A fruit tree is far more complicated. And there's some people say you're not allowed to cut down a tree for anything. There's a Jew that comes to visit here from Orange County, and he took me to his house once and he showed me the tree. He literally moved his house. In other words, the planning of the design was affected by that one fruit tree. That's not every opinion, but that's the sort of the extreme opinion. Okay, the parsha concludes with the law of Egla Arufa. Sounds like a very strange law. The special procedure to be followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer and his body is found in a field. So you find a dead body, you don't know who killed him. How often does that happen in New York City? I don't know. In any case, which underscores, so what it's a whole ceremony, which underscores the responsibility of the community and its leaders, not only for what they do, but also for what they might have prevented from being done. Fascinating law. You have to have the elders of the city come to that place, take a calf, kill the calf in next to a river, and make a declaration that it was not our fault. We didn't know. We didn't kill this guy. Fascinating ceremony with beautiful, beautiful implications. We can talk about that. It's the end of the parsha, but we could start from the end, right? We don't have a contract. You have to start from the beginning. But let's see what that is the end of the parsha. So there are many, many laws in this parsha. Many of them not mentioned earlier in the earlier 4 books, even though this is Deuteronomy, the repetition, but it has not been stated explicitly earlier that Moshe is saying it. It is written here, recorded here for the first time. Okay, so anybody wants to mention anything specific you want to talk about? Otherwise, we could begin. We could begin with the big ideas. So I guess what we would say is the first big idea in this parsha is, the most general idea in this parsha is that this portion is not talking about any specific, it's not just laws for specific people, right? There are mitzvot that an individual person has to do, right? You have to eat matzah, you have to put on tefillin. Yes, everyone has to do it, but it's on the individual. In this week's parsha, it's a sort of a new category of mitzvot. And it's mitzvot that are national mitzvot for the entire people. Supreme Court, king, war, right? All these institutions are not institutions that a person does on their own. It's not like, oh, I'm going to decide to go to war tomorrow. What laws do I follow? No, there has to be a collective national effort, and that's what we call war. And for that you need a king. I don't know if you need a king, but a king is also one of those things. It's not like I decide to appoint a king; it's the collective. Also, Supreme Court. It's not I appoint a court; the community as a whole appoints the court. Right. So you want to talk about what's unique about this parsha is how should the nation be set up, and that's why you understand why it's being recorded in Deuteronomy right before we're going into Israel, because for the first time after the last 40 years in the desert, now it's relevant to think about how are we going to establish the system of government in Israel, which we're going to cross into in a few days. At that point, it's been a few weeks later, because Moshe, this is the last 36 days of Moses' life. 30 days after Moshe passes, they cross the Jordan. So that's why that's a concept that almost all the mitzvot in this parsha are related to. The institutions of judges, Supreme Court, there's a prophet, king, priests. Well, we mentioned the priests before, but it reiterates the priests, prophets, city of refuge, also part of the justice system. Someone kills someone by mistake, they have to run to a city of refuge. Again, repeated here for the third time in the Torah. We'll talk about that as well, God willing. Also, not an individual person. If a community has to set up cities of refuge. And then you have, so that's already the sixth big idea. Well, we have the laws of witnesses. That's all part of the justice system, going to war. And then finally, even the seventh idea, the final portion, the portion of the Egla Rufa, the calf that you kill if you find someone that was dead, that was killed. Also, that's the community. That's the obligation of the court. So again, everything in this parsha, almost everything in this parsha, is referring to not individual mitzvot for individual people, but how do we set up the system of governance as a whole?
Is Israel set up that way?
Israel is not necessarily set up that way. However, there are certain principles in this parsha that become the sources for what we would understand as democratic values. Now, not exactly, there's a monarchy. Let's talk about the monarchy. That's one of the things I want to talk about. But what's the first thing you see in this week's parsha? First of all, you see separation of powers. Number one, there's multiple channels of authority. Who do we have authority in this week's parsha? There's no, in the classic monarchy, the king is representative of God and the king is all powerful. Maybe sometimes they have to fight with the church, depending on where you are. But ultimately, usually a good king, what does a good king do?
That's the church.
No, he becomes the head of the church.
Oh.
Right? That's much better. Why would you fight the church? You become the head of the church. Right? I think England, the monarch is the head of the Church of England. Am I right? I think so. I think that's the case. And any good monarch knows how to take over the other institutions. Okay, the parliament in the 1600s, whatever, 1400s started fighting back. But we think of a king, and the king in the ancient world certainly was the representative of God, all powerful. No one's going to tell him what to do. Okay, what do we have in this week's parsha? Different forms of leadership. First thing we have is separation of powers. First thing we have a court system, independent judiciary. Okay, then we have, let's see the order. I have to get the order right.
What page do you want?
So the parsha starts at page 1025. Shoftim v'shatrim, you should put judges and officers in all your cities. So that's the judiciary. Then if you turn the page to page 1027, verse 8, you start getting to the Supreme Court. Okay, so we have a court system and a Supreme Court. Only then this concept you have in this parsha for leadership is page 1029 is the king. Okay, let me share the screen a little bit. King. Now, what you hear about the king is a bunch of restrictions. King cannot have too much money, not too many wives, not too many horses. In other words, can't become too powerful, has to write additional Torah scroll, cannot go anywhere without the Torah. What does that show? It shows that you are subordinate to the law. Who's the law? The judges determine the law. The Supreme Court determines the law. Okay? So we first have the court system. Then we have a king that is limited, monarchy that's limited. We'll talk about the monarchy in a minute. Then you continue, and then you go to priests, another source of power. And then, of course, you have on page 1033, you have the Navi, you have the prophet. And the prophet, what is the prophet? What's the job of the prophet? To rebuke the king. That's what the prophets have been doing for a very long time. All the prophets, any good prophet goes and rebukes the king. Okay, now if you're a king, you don't want any prophets rebuking you because you don't want anyone rebuking you. Okay, so that's the first thing you say. So is Israel today set up this way? Not really. And if you think about it, is it exactly the same way? Not really. But the concept that we start looking at what the Torah sees, Torah's vision for a nation, how to govern. The first thing you see separation of powers. You see independent judiciary. The first thing is the law. Even if there's a king, or we'll see in a minute, it doesn't have to be a king, could it be other forms of leadership? But even if there's a king, we're talking about the king as in the executive has to be subordinate to the law. And then there are the king is not the moral voice. There are other moral voices. There's the priest, there's the prophet. Okay, and that becomes the Jewish laws. If you want to go to court, if the king wants to go to war, so today even the president can't go to war without an act of Congress. Well, depends. You can get around it if you need to, as we have known in the century. But you can't go to war without an act of Congress. In the Torah and the Jewish law, the king can't go to the war without the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, and the prophet. Right? Because the point is it a moral war? Is it a just cause? Right? So that's the first thing you see. You see the separation. You see the separation of power and the limitation of the monarch. So that's the first thing. There's a lot to say. Let's jump into the monarch right away. Let's talk about the laws of the monarchy. There's so much to talk about. There's a big debate here. And I want to just put it out here so you know at least the parameters of the debate. I'm just going to open up the screen here. I'm going to share the screen as soon as I find it. Okay, I'm looking at, let's share the screen. I am looking at chapter 17, verse 14. In the book, it is page 1029. Yeah, okay. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and live therein, and you will say, I will set a king over myself like all the nations around me. You shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses. From among your brothers, you shall set a king over yourself. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother. Okay, so the first requirement of a king is that you has to be of your brothers, to be Jewish. I think in the Constitution you have to be born in the United States to be president. Am I right?
That's right.
I think so. Okay.
Natural born citizen.
Natural born citizen. In the Israel, who was Rabin born?
Yeah, but go to my ear.
No. Ukraine. The first bunch of prime ministers were born outside of Israel, of course. They had to be. Yeah. Okay. Now we have limitations on the king's power. Only he may not acquire many horses for himself, so that he will not bring the people back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way anymore. So in other words, if you're trying to build an army, you're going to run to the superpower. Who's the superpower? So no, so he says, Lo yarba, you can't have abundance. What's the abundance? More than you need. Right? So why? Because then you're going to go to the superpower to get more horses. Egypt was the place where they bred the best horses. He shall not take many wives for himself. Remember, polygamy is permitted at that point. King Solomon didn't listen. He married 1,000 wives. Okay. But in any case, he can't have too many, and his heart must not turn away. And he shall not acquire much silver and gold for himself. And it will be when he sits upon his royal throne that he shall write for himself 2 copies of the Torah on a scroll, from that Torah which is before the Levitic Kohanim. In other words, the Levites, the Kohanim, the priests and the Levites have the original copy of the Torah. You make a copy of that, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this Torah and these statutes to perform them, so that his heart will not be haughty over his brothers, and so that he will not turn away from the commandments either to the right or to the left, in order that he may prolong his days in this kingdom, he and his sons among Israel. In other words, you have a limit on the king's power. He cannot have his army can't be too big, not too many wives, not too much money. And he has to have an additional copy of the Torah. What does it mean, an additional copy? So the commentaries explain that later on in Deuteronomy, Moshe says everyone has an obligation to write a Torah scroll. Everybody has to write a Torah scroll. Now, today we don't do that because you can fulfill the obligation by buying a book. In those days, you couldn't buy a Jewish book. So the only Torah you had was a Torah scroll. So you literally have to write a Torah scroll. If not, write it yourself, commission someone to write it. But that doesn't have to be wherever you go. You can leave it in your shelf. You can leave it in your house. You can leave it in the bookshelf. But the king has to have an additional one. In addition to the one that's on his bookshelf, he has to have literally one that's with him all the time. What does that show? The king's power is not supreme, is subservient to the Torah. Okay, that's the laws of the king. Let's go back to the beginning. I want to ask, I'm getting a little political here. In other words, we're talking about political science because this is what the parsha is about. Then we go back to the beginning and we start reinterpreting everything in the spiritual sense and how it applies to us in our life. Okay. No, I'm still on this parsha on the king. So if you look at on page 1029, and you look at verse 14, and you read verse 14 and 15, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you and to possess it and live therein, and you say, I will set a king over myself like all the nations around me. Verse 15, you shall set a king over you. Som tasim alecha melech. It's actually it's a double language. Place you shall place. Set you shall set. Som is to put. Som tasim in verse 15. Double language, which means you have to place it upon yourself. What it means is that you have to, usually it's emphasis. So you have to emphasis that you have to place his fear upon you. In other words, you have to, if you're accepting a king, part of that is accepting the yoke, accepting the power of the king. Okay. And then it continues about the conditions. So when you read verse 16 or 15, the natural way of reading it, and most people read it that way, is that there is a mitzvah to appoint a king. The sages say it. The sages say there were 3 mitzvot that were commanded when we enter Israel. One of them is appointing a king. Many people say it. The sages say it. Maimonides believes that, and that's the conventional opinion. The problem with the conventional opinion is when you open up the book of Samuel and you look at how, there's 2 problems with the conventional opinion. The first problem is when you look at how the Jewish people came to Samuel and asked Samuel to appoint a king. And Samuel was terribly offended. And he was upset. He said, what, I'm no good? He was a judge, not a king. He had no political power. So and when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, there was Joshua. After Joshua, there were the elders, judges for 300 years or more, almost 400 years. People were led by judges. Basically, it looked like 12 separate tribes. If they were attacked, let's say one tribe was attacked, the tribe would have to turn to other tribes and say, please come help us. Some tribes would come, some tribes wouldn't, right? But they had no standing army. They had no central power, central power of central political power. And that's the way they lived for a few hundred years. And all the judges were good people. None of them were corrupt. You know why? They had no power. Then the people come to Samuel and they say, make for us a king. And Samuel's offended. Well, I'm no good for you anymore. God comes to Samuel and says, don't be offended. They didn't reject you, Mr. Samuel. They rejected me, God. That's what God says. They want a king because they reject God. And it's a strange story because that's the first thing that happened. God says they rejected you. They rejected me. They rejected God. But then God says, okay, they want a king. Let's make them a king. And then you have the story where they go where Samuel appoints King Saul. And then later, King David, etc. You got to read the books, fascinating books. So the commentaries, I said one question, 1 second, I don't understand. If there's a mitzvah to appoint a king, how is it possible that Samuel was so upset when the people asked for it? And how is it possible that God actually accepted Samuel's rebuke? And he said, yes, that the request for a king was a terrible thing. So that's one big question. Another big question about the concept of saying that a monarch is a commandment. If you look at the history of the monarchy in Israel. So later the kingdom split. All the northern kingdom, the Israelite kingdoms, all of them were corrupt, almost all of them, almost without exception. And even the kings of David, the Davidic dynasty in the southern kingdom, some were better than others. But there was idol worship. None of that happened with the judges. In the era of the judges, there was no corruption. They had no political power. There was no corruption. So you look at the facts. That's the second problem. You look at the history, we see that the monarchy is not like they say in Yiddish, it's not a big lick. It's not all that it's cracked up to be. So why does God prefer and suggest that we have that monarchy, that we have that system of government? That's question number two. Question number one, if the monarchy is a mitzvah, the Jewish people came to Samuel and said, please make us a king. He should have said, Mazel Tov, you're doing a mitzvah. Instead, he's totally offended. So that's the problem. That's the problem with the conventional interpretation. The conventional answer, it's not a good answer, not a perfect answer, but the conventional answer is as follows. The conventional answer is that when you look at the people, when they came to Samuel to request that Hashem that Samuel appointed king for them, they say, please make us a king like all the nations around us. Oh, so the commentaries say that's the problem. Problem is you want a king, not because God told you want a king because you want to be like everybody else. That's a problem. So now Ken has a question. What's your question?
I have a couple of questions.
Well, let's start with the one you're looking at right now. The one you're looking at right now, I could anticipate it, but go ahead. I'll let you say it.
Well, what I was thinking was, if the Bible tells you to do something,
Yeah.
then in not appointing a king, isn't that
It's a violation. That's right. So that's another question. If it's a mitzvah to appoint a king, then why did they wait? Why did they wait for 300 years or more, almost 400 years? And the other question is a question on my answer, which I said, some people say the critique of the Jewish people when they asked for a king for Samuel was they said, we want a king like all other kings. The problem with that interpretation is that if you look at this week's Parsha, it says in verse 14, this is exactly what it says. When you come to the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and you live therein, and you will say, I will set a king over myself, like all the nations around me. That's exactly what you're allowed to ask for. So what is going on here?
That's the second question.
Yeah.
What changed that they went to Samuel?
What changed they went to Samuel? So the answer is they became corrupt. In other words, not became corrupt. There is a certain, why did the American colonies decide to federate, to become one country? There's a certain advantage to having a central power. No, there's a certain advantage because then, for example, if you have a standing army, tribes, the king could force all the people could make an army and draft people. So protection and also commerce. You become a much stronger political commercial force because it's not 12 different independent regions that each trade by themselves and have their own regulation, but you also create all of a sudden you have the commerce clause where the central government decides how to conduct the commerce. So there are certain advantages, there are certain disadvantages, but those are the advantages. So at that point, with the Philistines, there were problems with neighbors, so the Philistines attacking certain tribes. So the people said, we're not ready, let's make a king. And by the way, the first job of the king was to go to battle against the Philistines. And that's what kept Saul busy for his whole career. And that's what kept David busy for his whole career. Only Solomon had peace because his father wiped out all the bad guys. But the point is, you see why people would want it. But the question is, again, we're going back to the question, is it a commandment? And like I said, the conventional interpretation is it is a commandment. There are many questions on that interpretation. So the first thing I'm going to say is that I'm going to give one more defense of the conventional, and then I'm going to give you the unconventional. One more defense of the conventional is 14 is the verse telling you what may happen, which is not a good idea. 15 is what you should do. So, in other words, verse 14 says, when you come to the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and live therein, and you say, I will set a king over myself, like all the nations around me. Verse 14 does not tell you a mitzvah, it just tells you a story. And that's exactly what happened. Verse 14, this verse is copied and pasted in the Bible with the Samuel. They went to Samuel and they said exactly this. They said, make us the king like all the nations around us. Verse 14 is a terrible idea. If you come and ask for verse 14, God will be upset. Let's look at what God wants you to do. Verse 15, you shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses. Meaning, don't choose a king because everyone around you has a king, and then your kings will be like their kings, basically corrupt, power-hungry people. You should choose a king you should appoint a king that God will choose, meaning an ethical and moral person. So based on this reading, this is my favorite reading for the conventional interpretation. 14 is the problem. The problem is you will come and you will ask for a king, but you're asking for the king for the wrong motivation. Because you're saying, I want to be like everybody else. And then in 15, God says, that's not the reason for a king. Let me tell you how you should want a king, and you should appoint a king that God will choose. Okay, fine. That's the conventional interpretation. We gave him enough real estate. Now we're going to give the unconventional interpretation. And the earliest proponent of the non-conventional interpretation is a great sage named Abarbanel. Everyone heard of Mr. Isaac Abarbanel, and he was the finance minister for the king of Spain when the Jewish people were expelled. Brilliant statesman, brilliant finance minister. He saw the power of the monarchy up close. He wrote very prolific interpretations of the entire Bible, including the 5 books of Moses. And he says something fascinating. He wrote, I just read it again this morning because I haven't read it for a few years, pages and pages, questions, impossibility that a monarchy is a mitzvah. And he mentioned some of the things he mentioned is Dr. Ken's question. If it's a mitzvah, how is it possible that Joshua didn't fulfill the mitzvah? How is it possible that all the judges didn't fulfill the mitzvah? They only waited 400 years to appoint a king. That was your question.
But it says when you come to the land. It
Yeah.
doesn't say how long you have.
I know, but if it's a mitzvah, let's do a mitzvah right away. We have the principle that mitzvah haba liyadcha atach mitzena. If a mitzvah, you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, don't delay it.
Yeah.
Right? That's the principle. So, long story short, what Abarbanel says, and he goes into all the philosophers who explain that why you need a king and why king is so good. Of course, these are all justifications. They were on the payrolls. All the philosophers were on the payrolls of the kings. So he goes and attacks each opinion. It's not such a good idea to have a monarchy. And then he says, look around the world. The kings that have the countries that have democracy, this is in the 1400s, so it wasn't the conventional democracy. They're much more successful and much more moral. And he quotes the kingdom of Venice, and I never looked it up. I googled it this morning. Venice had some sort of republic from the 11th century to like the 17th century. And he says, Rabatiyam, this is a beautiful city. The city of Venice was like sort of the most famed country, the most powerful. In other words, in some ways, they were very financially successful. They're doing just fine. They have no monarch. They have people get together. It's a republic. Every 2-3 years, the leaders change. Wonderful. He says this whole thing of a monarch is a bad idea. So why does the Torah tell you to make a monarch? Says that Abarbanel, Torah never told you to make a monarch. What? Verse 15 says to make a monarch. No, it's not what the Torah says. According to Abarbanel, if you want a king, here's what I'm going to tell you. The mitzvah is, if you appoint a king, make sure the king is Jewish. Make sure he doesn't have too many wives. Make sure he has too much money. Make sure he doesn't have too many horses. That's no mitzvah to be a king. For example, the mitzvah, the joke is, next week's parsha, read the mitzvah of divorce. Is there a mitzvah to divorce your wife? No. The mitzvah is, if you divorce, you do it this way. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference. It's no obligation. It's if you choose to do this, you're permitted to do so. If you want to make a king because everyone else has it, that again should be an indication. God is not endorsing this. You want to be like everybody, right? When you go to your mother and you say, I want it because everyone else has it. Right away, your mother says, so if everyone jumps off the Empire State Building, will you jump off the Empire State Building? Right? So right away, when the Torah says, if that's the justification because everybody else wants it, so then this is not a mitzvah. But the Torah says, verse 15, Abarbanel says, nah, the Torah doesn't say it's a mitzvah. The Torah says, if you're going to make a king, if you want to make a king, this is how you do it. And there are many examples that he brings. Next week's parsha, there's a strange mitzvah. If you go to battle and you conquer the people and you see a woman, a beautiful woman who's not Jewish and you want to marry her. Oh, a bunch of commandments. Is there a mitzvah that you have to want to marry her? Of course not. The mitzvah is if you want to do it, that's the way it should be done. There's no endorsement to that desire. There's no endorsement to the desire to want to have a king. It's if you want to have a king, this is the way it's done. That is the Abarbanel, who at that point that he said it was radical. I don't think anybody else said it. After he said it, other people start following suit. And the convention, and then you get to another interpretation that you get nowadays. This is already in the 19th century, and they say something interesting. They say the mitzvah of a king is not really a monarchy. The mitzvah is find the best way for executive leadership that works in your time and apply it. It could be a monarchy, it could be a democracy, it could be theocracy, it could be anarchy. Torah is not telling you what to do. The Torah is telling you you have the judge that tells you the law. Then you have to be a practical leadership. Do the best way that works at that time. Where do you see that? So there's a beautiful interpretation from the Netziv of Volozhin. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in the famed Yeshiva in Volozhin. his great granddaughter used to come here. And he says like this, he says, what is the verse saying? You'll come to the land and you will say, I will set a king over myself like all the nations that are around me. What is the Torah saying? Torah is saying, look around you. Look at all systems of government, find the best one and apply it. We know what Churchill said, that democracy is a terrible system of government. It's just better than all the other ones, right? So that's what we're saying here, is we're saying that the Torah here, according to this interpretation, the Torah is actually not giving you a mitzvah, but Torah is telling you, find not for a king. King could be political leadership. It could be a parliament. It could be whatever you want. Just look around and see what works.
Is it in quotes?
What?
In Hebrew also?
There's no quotes in the Torah, but that's what it means. Yeah, it's quoting what you would say.
They put it in quotes.
Yeah, that's what you will say. You will say, I will place a king. I will appoint a king over myself. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to, before we go back and start talking about the specifics of how this applies spiritually, I want to say a few things. Number one, I want to say is that this parsha, like I mentioned earlier, this parsha talks about the mitzvah upon the nation, the collective. Appoint a king, appoint a Supreme Court, appoint judges in every city, appoint a Supreme Court, appoint a king, a prophet, a priest, how to go to war. Okay. What's the danger of creating a nation? One of the dangers of creating a nation and focusing on the national interests. The danger is that when you focus on the national interests, what's the danger? You forget about the individual's federalism. You forget about the individual's rights and even the protection of the individual. And especially when you're going to build a country. When you want to build a country, you want to build. So an individual gets hurt, who cares, right? That's the price of building, right? You talk about, when I once wrote about this, I started Googling how much each project, how many people died to create each project. Brooklyn Bridge, nobody knows how many people died. They stopped counting after a while. Panama Canal, 20,000 people died. The Great Wall of China, hundreds of thousands of people died. That doesn't matter. We have a national project. The individual person is less important. Okay. Now let's look at this week's parsha. This week's parsha, you see, at least in two places, that there's an emphasis about preserving the life of every individual, not just life, the rights of every individual, even in the context of when you're going to create when you're trying to grow and build, right? The price of growth, right? Today you're talking about developing countries. Developing countries, you say, oh, they have to develop. So, okay, so they could pollute or whatever the case is. The developing countries, you have to develop. So there's a price that you're going to pay, the expense of the individual's right. Here we're going to see at least two places where the collective cannot be at the expense of the individual. So the first example, and the Torah keeps, I mentioned this earlier, Torah keeps reiterating the law of the cities of refuge. Cities of refuge is an interesting law. Somebody kills someone by mistake. They have to run to a city of refuge and they have to stay there until the death of the high priest. So it's not prison, because the Torah doesn't believe in prison. Because for the Torah, the most important thing that makes you human is free choice. That's what makes you human. So if the Constitution of the United States says that you can't have inhumane treatment, you can't people treat not the Constitution. The Supreme Court says you can't have inhumane punishment. So we say, okay, no corporal punishment, we'll put you in prison. From the Torah's perspective is, no, prison is not more humane. To the contrary, prison takes away the one thing that makes you human, which is your free choice. So in the Torah, there's corporal punishment, but no prison. If you think about it. But whatever the case is, so there's no prison, but you're confined to a city. So in that sense, it's a punishment. For a city of refuge, when you're protected when you're in that city, but you're in the city, you can do whatever you want in that city. That's the city of refuge. Now, the city of refuge, the laws of the city of refuge this is the third time the Torah is reiterating this law. Why is it so important? And why is it so important to reiterate it again? We had it in the end of the fourth book, we had it in the beginning of the fifth book, and here once again in the middle of the fifth book. We keep saying it 3 times, the same law, Ganukshan. I'm not for ready. So one of the interpretations is, what does this law tell you? This law is, the whole example is, if you're going to the forest to chop wood, and by mistake, there's a work accident. And while you were chopping wood, the wood fell and killed somebody, right? In a developing nation, that's fine. You're going to build, there's going to be accidents, and who cares? That's the price to pay. Torah says, no, the building of Israel cannot be at the expense of not protecting human life. And we have to show that even inadvertent killing is something we have to protect against. And if you're chopping trees to build, that's not an excuse not to be extra cautious, right? The price of development can't take away the caution and protection of human life. And if you're going to kill someone, even inadvertently, even in the process of building your country, you still have to go. You still have to run to the city of refuge, because that is something that we cannot tolerate, that the building of the collective will be at the price of the individual. That's one place where you see it. We can elaborate upon it. Another fascinating place is the laws of war. Absolutely fascinating. Well, there are many laws of war, but I'm going to talk about toward the end of the parsha. We had it in the nutshell as well. And this is actually mind-boggling if you think about it. So I'm turning to, well, I just turned it on the screen. It's right here, but in the book, it's in the book, it's page 1039.
And what's the pasuk?
Well, it starts, we're going to look at verse 5. Chapter 20, verse 5. So we're about to go to war, and then before they go to war, so the priest would speak to the people. Page 1039. We're going to look at, okay, we can start at verse 3, why not? And you shall say to them, in other words, when you approach, let's go to verse 2. And it will be, when you approach the battle, that the Kohen shall come near and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel. You ever heard of that term, Shema Yisrael? So there's a beautiful Hasidic commentaries in this. I don't know if we'll get to it today. If not today, then God willing next year. In any case, Hear, O Israel. Today you are approaching the battle against your enemies. Let your hearts not be faint. You shall not be afraid, and you shall not be alarmed, and you shall not be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. That's the priest's speech. Verse 4 is actually incorporated by the Israeli chief rabbinate into the blessing that we say, or that people say, that we say for the members of the IDF on Shabbat. So there's a long Mishaberach, they quote from this verse. They quote verse 4, because that's what the priest would tell the soldiers before they go to war. Don't be afraid. Because by the way, Maimonides talks about this at length. The greatest danger for an army is fear. Like FDR said, right? I think. And after that, verse 5 is a crazy verse. Verse 5, 6, and 7 is crazy verse. And the officer shall speak to the people, saying, What man is there who has built a new house and has not yet inaugurated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man inaugurate it. And what man is there who has planted a vineyard and has not yet redeemed it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man redeem it. And what man is there who has betrothed the woman and has not yet taken her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the war and another man take her. In other words, like this. And then they continue and they say, whoever's fearful should go home. That's verse 8. And that's everybody.
That's the whole army.
That's the whole army. But you'd rather have a small army than a large army who's afraid. Okay. I read somewhere reading about the Second World War, the D-Day, that they wanted no soldiers who were ever in battle were allowed to go on D-Day. Soldiers from the First World War, because no one with experience. The young people are foolish. They don't understand what war is. So that's what I read. But in any case, fear is a problem. Fear is a problem. Fear debilitates. You can't do anything with fear. Okay. What do we see here? We're talking about an army. Think about nationalism. Think about even fascism, any ism, any time where you have a collective need. The whole idea, what they tell you is, forget about the individual, you should be devoted to the cause. And the greatest time to do this, the cause is time of war. We're going to war. The entire country is at stake. You have to suspend your own needs for the collective. What are we saying? You got married? You just got married? Go home. Oh, you planted a vineyard? You never had a chance to eat the fruit? Go home. You built a new house? You didn't move in yet? Go home. What kind of nonsense is that? I mean, you don't want a war like that. You don't want a country like that. What is the Torah telling you? Torah is telling you that the needs of the collective cannot uproot the needs of the individual. Just because you have a war, which a war is basically the need of everybody, that doesn't take away the need of the collective, doesn't take away from the rights. Before we had it, the life, but here, even the rights, the pleasure of the individual. It's a mind-boggling concept. And the Torah keeps emphasizing it specifically in the Parsha, where we talk about the needs of the collective. So that is a little bit about the Torah system of running the nation. Talk about the separation of powers. We talk about the not forgetting about the importance of the importance is too weak of a word. The protecting the individual right to life. In other words, a country, the purpose of the kingdom is to protect the life of the individual. And if to build you have to kill someone inadvertently, or to build you have to for development you have to lower if you're going to lower the protections for the worker because you're building, then that's not the country the Torah wants. So it's no excuse. The building is no excuse to kill someone in the forest by mistake. I wasn't careful. That's negligence. But I was building for the country. Too bad. It's negligence, right? So you have to curb the development for the protection of individual life. And then you see, like I said, that you see at war, it's the most extreme. War is the time when you're going to be looking to, I'm thinking about the needs of the collective. But even then, it cannot suspend the right of the individual. I think this is beautiful. Okay, that's the big ideas. Now we can go back and start looking at the Parsha more from the psychological, personal perspective. And then we have a few minutes left to do that. So let's try to do that. And in the meantime, any comments, questions, jokes, disagreements, plugs for the monarchy or plugs for democracy or plugs for anarchy, whatever you want to promote here, you have a few seconds to promote. I don't know what system of government you like or you don't like. I don't want to get too political, but states' rights or federal rights, I don't know what you want to do. Okay.
And I just heard that when Israel was being formed and they were having the big celebration for it, they were debating whether to have England or France speak. And they knew that if England spoke, France would be upset, and France spoke, England would be upset. So they went back to the very first democracy, which actually was Iceland in, I think, 1290. And so that's who spoke.
Fascinating. But I don't think Abarbanel heard of Iceland because it was somewhere. You know the joke. My brother's in Iceland, so they say the joke.
Yeah.
The joke is that Greenland is ice and Iceland is green.
Yeah.
So how do they get the name? Purposely, like you say, to get rid of to steer the traffic away from the islands. So I don't know if Abarbanel heard about it, but for him, Venice was the sort of the heart of Europe. It's in Italy, parts of Europe, and it was a powerhouse, a commercial powerhouse. So when Abarbanel says, you need proof that a monarchy is a bad idea, he says, go look at Europe right now. The best country is the country that where there's no monarchy and is a republic. So I thought that was fascinating. Okay, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for that. I don't want to get political, but in Israel, of course, we're talking about everybody wants to think about the judicial and if the judiciary should be independent or not, it should be independent, but who appoints the judges? So that, of course, is all related to this week's Parsha. And I have what to say, but not here and not recorded. Okay, fine. Let's go to the beginning of the Parsha. Why not?
Is there a limitation on the number of judges that Israel is able to choose?
Every city has to have judges. The Supreme Court, the tradition is that there's supposed to be 71. And the reason why we get it from is when Moshe tells God in the whoops. I still have a few minutes. In the fourth book of the Torah, in the third portion of the fourth book, Moshe says, I can't handle the people. They want meat. I can't deal with them. God says, don't worry, we'll appoint people to help you. And they appoint 70 people. 70 with Moses is 71. And the Supreme Court has to have an odd number. So you have 71. So that's the precedence that the top authority has 71. So there's 71 judges on the Supreme Court. But then you have to have a judge in every city and every town, every region and every town. And it's very interesting because the Torah, it's not just practically that people should be able to go to give me just 1 second. People should be able to go to a court when you have a dispute. It's not just practically, because the mitzvah is that in Israel, if you look at okay, let's open up the screen. Let's go back. Let's go to the verses. Share the screen. Let's go to the beginning. Okay, so we're talking about page 1025. Okay, so if you look at verse 1, the first verse, chapter 16, verse 18. First verse of the parsha, right? So page 1025. The verse says as follows: "You shall set up judges and law enforcement officials for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you." So it says two things. It says in all your cities, and then it says for your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So the commentaries explain you have to have judges in every city, and then you have to have sort of circuit judges above that in every tribe, in every region, right? Because the tribe is the broader region. So the commentaries say, because it says put the judges in every city, only in every city which Hashem the Lord gives you, the Chal Sharecha, in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you, meaning referring to the land of Israel, meaning in Israel you have an obligation to put a judge in every city. Outside of Israel, there's no obligation to put a judge in every city. If we're living in Brooklyn, living in Greenwich, even if you want to have a Jewish court, because let's say in Babylonia we had the autonomy to have Jewish courts. Even in this country, you could have Jewish courts for monetary matters. But whatever the case is, this doesn't say you have to do it in every city, have it in every county, have it in every region. It's fine. Doesn't have to have it in every city. In Israel, it has to be every city. How come? So maybe, I don't know, I haven't seen this written explicitly, maybe because the Torah is telling you the land of Israel, more than anywhere else, the land of Israel as the place that Hashem gives you, is the place where we're supposed to live and express the ideals of the Torah more than any other place. So the court is not just a technical way how to administer justice when two people are fighting over $1. The court is the symbol of the will of Hashem coming through the Torah. So we want to show that at Israel, our right to Israel and our living in Israel is based on the commandments of the Torah. So that's why in the Torah, you have in Israel, more than outside of Israel, where you can have a court in every region. In Israel, it has to be in every city. Because the court is not just a mechanical process, a technical process that will help people navigate disputes. That's only the practical side of justice. The essential point here is the moral point. The moral point is we're establishing our lives based on the morality set out in the Torah. And the court and the law is the vehicle that makes that morality known. So in Israel, it's even more important to be connected to the system of the Torah. So that's I think that's correct. Okay, let's read the first few verses. Very interesting verses. The first three verses are very powerful, very famous. Everyone knows them. The late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, I think that she had on her desk, she had verse 20. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. That's verse 20. Third verse of this week's parsha. Right? Beautiful verse. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. In any case, verse 18, 19, 20 talks about the justice system. Appoint judges in every city. Verse 29, of course, don't show favoritism. Don't take bribery. For bribery blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts just words. And then you have justice, justice shall you pursue. Okay. Verse 21 and 22 seem totally out of character. I have no idea what it's doing here. What does verse 21 and 22 say? All of a sudden, you go into a bunch of laws of idol worship. That's going to the next chapter. Verse 2 is idol worship, etc. But even before idol worship, verse 20, you shall not plant for yourself an Asherah or any tree near the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make for yourself. What does that mean? Asherah is a tree that people would plant for worship. They would plant a tree for worship. And also, they would also plant trees, not Asherah, different trees. They would plant trees next to their altar, next to their idol. So there's two things. You plant a tree to worship, and then you plant a tree next to the idol. What does the Torah say? We cannot plant Asherah and any tree next to the Mizbeach, next to the altar. We have to, when you come to the altar, there should be no tree, no shade. Now, why? If you're living in the Middle East, why do you plant trees next to the altar?
Stay cool.
Because you want people to congregate. If you have a choice, where are you going to go? Where are you going to eat your lunch? Middle of the sun? Where are you going to go for shade? So what they did was, wherever there was shade, there was an idol. And then everybody is serving the idols. That's what the idol worshippers do. It's very clever. Torah says no. When you come to God, when you come to the Mizbeach, there's no shade, no trees, no shade. Now, the conventional interpretation is we're just trying to be different than the idol worshippers. A lot of laws in the Torah, Maimonides says, we do to be different than the idol worshippers. But there's obviously a much deeper interpretation. And why do you have to talk about idol worship here? And then verse in chapter 17, verse 2, it starts talking about what the laws if somebody comes and tries to convince people to serve idols, that you have to kill the person, etc. Why idol worship? Why are we just putting idol worship in the middle of the system of justice? So one interpretation that I think is a beautiful interpretation is as follows. Let me just check if I'm. Okay, it's not in my notes. I don't know who said it. One of the interpretations is as follows. Idol worship is the antithesis of justice. If you're going to have justice, you can't have an idol. You can't have an idol worship next to the judges. You're talking about judges, you have to right away say, we don't believe in idol worship. Why? Say, well, we don't like idols. But what's the point here? The point here is like this. The mindset of the pagan is that nature controls everything because they serve the forces of nature. So why are you serving nature? Because nature, you serve the forces of nature because they're all powerful. What's the mindset of monotheism? No, nature is just a creation. God is above the creation. And God is not trapped by the creation. And if you're a human being and you have a spark of God within you, you're also not trapped by creation. Okay, let's say you're a pagan. The pagans believe that nature reigns supreme. So what does that mean? How does that translate to my own life? My own life, that means if I have natural instincts, I cannot overcome them because I'm ruled by my natural instincts. Just like the universe is ruled by nature, I'm also ruled by nature, by my natural instincts. And therefore, if I have an instinct to kill you and I kill you, you can't take me to court because if I wanted to do it, that's who I am. I can't stop it. And that's why in the pagan societies, there was automatically built-in immorality in every pagan society in the ancient world. Why? Because it wasn't just I'm bowing down to a stone or to multiple stones instead of bowing down to God. That it's a much deeper concept. The question is, what do you believe about the power of nature? And if you believe the power of nature is supreme, then there's no reason to assume that my nature, I could change my nature, or I can go against my nature, or I can go against my instincts. So there's no justice if there's idol worship. If you believe that you're trapped by your nature, there's no justice. There's no justice, there's no morality. Whole idea of morality is we hold people accountable because we believe that you are in control of your actions. Your nature, your instincts are not in control of your actions. You are in control of your actions. You can overcome your nature. Okay, that is the antithesis of the perspective of the pagan. And that's why if you're going to talk about justice, the first thing we say, idol worship is rejected because idol worship, if you believe in idol worship, there's no space for justice. Because justice is basically, the concept of justice is the acknowledgement that people have free choice. And it's really the celebration of free choice. That's really what justice is all about, what morality is all about. And therefore, as soon as the Torah says, place judges at every city, right away, a series of laws against idol worship. No trees next to the altar, no trees of worship next to the altar. If anyone tries to convince other people to serve idols, they're a moral threat because of what idol worship represents, which is that I am subject to the laws of nature. I'm trapped by the laws of nature. I'm trapped by my own nature, and I cannot overcome my instincts. And if that's the case, there's no morality. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. A lot more to say. Hopefully we can meet again in good health next year and continue the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Chodesh Tov.